Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, March 16th, 2023. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen tells senators on the Finance Committee the nation's banking system remains sound and that people who had accounts in the two regional banks that just collapsed can feel confident they will not lose money after the steps taken by the Biden administration. Defense Department releases video of Russian military jets buzzing, dumping fuel on, and in one case hitting and damaging a U.S. drone, which was scuttled by the U.S. into the Black Sea. White House and Pentagon asked today why the footage was made public, and could the Russian government spin it that Russia's war against Ukraine is really a conflict with the U.S. Biden administration reportedly pressing the Chinese company that owns the app TikTok to sell that video app or be banned from the U.S. We'll get the reaction from the White House press secretary. U.S. Senate votes to advance a bill to repeal the congressional authorizations for the wars in Iraq, 1991 and 2002. The 2002 AUMF, as it's known, has been used over the years by presidents for other military operations. We'll hear from the bill's sponsors in the Senate and talk about it with the CEO of the group Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. And a bill introduced to write into law recent Supreme Court decisions that expand Second Amendment gun rights. It's the top Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee that's sponsoring it, and it comes a day after the Democratic chair of that committee held a hearing criticizing those Supreme Court decisions. We start with the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen before the Senate Finance Committee. And the main topic of the hearing when it was scheduled some time ago was to be the president's federal budget request for fiscal year 2024. And there were questions about that today, but also on the minds of the senators and the secretary, the U.S. banking system. This after the collapse of the two regional banks in the past week, Silicon Valley Bank in California, Signature Bank in New York. It's the second and third largest bank failures in U.S. history. The secretary brought it up in her opening statement.
This week, the government took decisive and forceful actions to stabilize and strengthen public confidence in our financial system. First, we worked with the Federal Reserve and FDIC to protect all depositors of the two failed banks. On Monday morning, customers were able to access all of the money in their deposit accounts so they could make payroll and pay the bills. Shareholders and debt holders are not being protected by the government. Importantly, no taxpayer money is being used or put at risk with this action. Deposit protection is provided by the Deposit Insurance Fund, which is funded by fees on banks. Second, the Federal Reserve is providing additional support to the banking system with a new lending facility. This will help financial institutions meet the needs of all of their depositors. I can reassure the members of the committee that our banking system is sound and that Americans can feel confident that their deposits will be there when they need them. This week's actions demonstrate our resolute commitment to ensure that our financial system remains strong and that depositors' savings remain safe.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, part of her opening statement at today's Senate Finance Committee hearing on Capitol Hill. The Secretary also saying that liquidity was a problem, an important role in the two bank failures this week, but the Biden administration's quick action made sure the damage was contained. Senator James Lankford, Republican from Oklahoma, asking the Secretary today if banks in his state are also now protected.
Will the deposits in every community bank in Oklahoma, regardless of their size, be fully insured now? Are they fully recovered? Every bank, every community bank in Oklahoma, regardless of the size of the deposit, will they get the same treatment that SVBP just got or Signature Bank just got?
A bank only gets that treatment if a majority of the FDIC board, a supermajority of the Fed board, and I, in consultation with the president, determine that the failure to protect uninsured depositors would create systemic risk and significant economic and financial consequences.
So what is your plan?
And we made that determination.
Right. So what is your plan to keep large depositors from moving their funds out of community banks into the big banks? We have seen the mergers of banks over the past decade. I'm concerned you're about to accelerate that by encouraging anyone who has a large deposit in a community bank to say, we're not going to make you whole, but if you go to one of our preferred banks, we will make you whole at that point.
Look, I mean, that's certainly not something that we're encouraging.
That is happening right now.
That is happening because depositors are concerned about the bank failures that have happened and whether or not other banks could also
No,
fail.
it's happening
And
because you're fully insured no matter what the amount is. If you're in a big bank, you're not fully insured if you're in a community bank.
Well, you're not fully insured. And
You were at Signature, and it just barely met that threshold. You were at Signature.
Well, we felt that there was a serious risk of contagion that could have brought down and triggered runs on many banks. And that's something, given that our judgment is that the banking system overall is safe and sound, depositors should have confidence in the system, and we took these actions.
So there's a special
discourage
assessment that's been done on community banks in my state and all banks across the country. Was there any discussion that that special assessment would only apply to the larger banks, or was it always assumed the special assessment would cover every bank, including rural banks in my state?
I think, I'm not certain what the rules are around that. That's for the FDIC to determine.
It has been reported publicly that SVB had a large number of Chinese investors that are there, including some that were companies directly connected to the Chinese Communist Party. Will those individuals, companies, entities, and investors that are Chinese investors be made whole based on assessments in my banks in Oklahoma? So what I'm asking is, will my banks in Oklahoma pay a special assessment to be able to make Chinese investors whole from Silicon Valley Bank?
Uninsured investors will be made whole in that bank, and I suppose that could include foreign depositors, but I don't believe there's any legal basis to discriminate among uninsured.
I get it, but I'm just saying that my community banks are going to pay this additional fee. It is always fascinating to me as well, the conversation that taxpayers are being made whole in this, that taxpayers are not going to have any kind of consequence on this. I'm sure my bankers are going to be very excited to know they no longer pay taxes.
Senator James Lankford, Republican from Oklahoma, questioning the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen at today's Finance Committee hearing. A story from Reuters: a bipartisan majority of Americans oppose U.S. taxpayers footing the bill when bad management causes a bank to fail. Though Republican opposition to bank bailouts has softened over the last decade, a Reuters Ipsos poll completed on Wednesday found. The two-day poll found 84% of respondents, including strong majorities of Republicans and Democrats, think taxpayers should not have to pay to resolve problems caused by irresponsible bank management. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, has introduced a bill to repeal part of the 2018 bank regulation rollback. The bill would place banks with at least $50 billion in assets back under Federal Reserve oversight and the so-called stress test from the Dodd-Frank Act. It was the 2018 bill that raised the minimum to $250 billion. Senator Warren brought this up today with Secretary Yellen.
If stress tests are done right, if we have robust stress tests, the way you described 6 years ago when you were still running the Fed, do they just test one thing that might go wrong, or do they test for lots of different problems if they're done right?
If they're done right, they test for many possible problems, but they do not focus on liquidity.
Okay, but they test
focus
for
on
many
capital.
kinds of things that go wrong. Is that right? Potentially.
Yes, there are different scenarios every year, and
so let me ask you then a related question. is one of the problems that stress tests can expose is that you have managers who are not very good at managing risk, or management that is otherwise doing a bad job that could put a bank in jeopardy.
Well, that's the purpose of supervision, and supervision, stress tests are one tool, supervision is another tool that's critical.
Okay, so
Focuses
very
on other
important. We've got stress tests, we've got supervision, we've got a lot of pieces here to make this work. In 2018, though, Trump's bank deregulation law and the door it opened for Fed Chair Powell to further hack away at the rules created an exception to annual Fed-administered stress tests, letting banks from $50 billion to $250 billion effectively off the hook. And that meant that a bank like SVB, which had $209 billion in assets when it failed, would be exempt from annual stress testing. So the question I have here is, if the law had not, let's not just do stress tests. It's stress test, it's the whole package. Enhanced liquidity requirements that ensure that banks have enough cash on hand to meet their obligations, particularly in times of stress, capital requirements that better position banks to absorb losses, regular resolution plans to help guide regulators safely through winding down failed banks. All of these were weakened in 2018, and when SVB failed, this is a part, in my view, of the Fed's actions that led to weaker regulation.
Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, questioning the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen at today's Senate Finance Committee hearing. We covered the full hearing. You can find the video at our website, cspan.org. A number of other senators bringing up the banking financial situation. Senator Mark Warner, Democrat from Virginia, said that social media may have played a role in the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. He said, "I think this will go down as history's first internet-driven run," and he likened it to crying fire in a crowded theater. Senator John Cornyn, Republican of Texas, suggesting regulators were asleep at the wheel. Senator Michael Bennet, Democrat from Colorado, said the way Silicon Valley was operating was not prudentially sound, and I hope that the regulators would be a backstop. Again, find the full video at cspan.org. A few other headlines today. A joint statement from the Federal Reserve, Treasury Department, and FDIC that First Republic Bank has reached an agreement to receive $30 billion from some of the largest banks in the U.S. to stabilize its balance sheet. Those banks include Bank of America, Citigroup, J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley. And this from CNBC, financial institutions took billions in short-term loans this week from the Federal Reserve as the industry copes with a serious crisis of confidence and liquidity. The central bank reported Thursday, utilizing tools the Fed rolled out Sunday. Banks looking for cash infusions borrowed $11.9 billion from the Bank Term Funding Program. Under that facility, banks can take one-year loans under favorable terms of exchange for high-quality collateral. Wall Street today, the Dow up 371, NASDAQ up 283, S&P up 68. This is Washington Today. The Russian news site 4Post reports that the American MQ-9 Reaper drone, which was shot down over the Black Sea, has been found near Sevastopol at a depth of nearly 3,000 feet. Sevastopol publication 4Post reporting this news, citing a source close to Russia's defense ministry familiar with the details. The Post also saying a Russian warship is currently on duty at the site of the crash, and the perimeter of the crash zone is under guard. The Pentagon did release video from that drone showing Russian military planes dumping fuel on it and apparently hitting it, damaging its propeller. Then the Pentagon says that forced the U.S. to intentionally bring it down over the water. Reporter asking the spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, John Kirby, today about the decision to release the video.
It is not uncommon at all for us to release imagery of these intercepts. We've done it plenty of times before. I think you all know that. To lay bare and to make clear to the rest of the world the manner in which the Russians have been just flat out lying about their account. So it was in that vein that we that we very much in keeping with past practice to lay out that imagery. But we did want to take the proper amount of time to make sure that the imagery was suitable for public release. In other words, that in releasing it, we weren't releasing content that might put our own operational security at risk, or our ability to collect intelligence at risk. And number two, that it was clear and convincing evidence of the account that we laid out there, and of course it did, and so now it's out there. Now, as in terms of whether or not we think that the Russians intercepted this aggressively enough to escalate or to try to basically realize Putin's empty rhetoric, which he's been spouting since the beginning of the war, that this is really about the West versus Russia. I would certainly, I'm in no position to speak for the Russian Ministry of Defense or their motivations. I would just point to a couple of things. One, this wasn't the first intercept of our drones in that airspace. It's happened before. It's not uncommon for them to intercept. Two, that while it is clear that it was aggressive flying, reckless flying, that they were dumping fuel, and that they struck the drone. Those 3 points were clear and convincing, which were the 3 points that we made to all of you before the release of the video. It is not clear to us that the pilot intended to strike the drone. It's at best it's reckless flying. At worst, it's reckless and incompetent. But we don't know whether it is also intentional. And the video doesn't show us that. So I can't point to that video and say that this is a deliberate intent to escalate or to bring about, tangibly bring about Putin's false claim that this is about the West versus Russia. The last thing I'll say on this is we do not, and we have made clear on many occasions, we do not seek a conflict with Russia. We do mean to continue to support Ukraine. We do mean to bolster our presence and our deterrence capability along NATO's eastern flank. And these kinds of flights in international airspace, over international sea space, will continue in support of those objectives.
John Kirby is Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council, speaking with reporters in a virtual news conference today. Associated Press writes that Russia and NATO member countries routinely intercept each other's warplanes, but the drone incident marked the first time since the Cold War that a U.S. aircraft went down during such a confrontation, raising concerns it could bring the United States and Russia closer to a direct conflict. At the Pentagon today, the Press Secretary Pat Ryder asked the same questions that you just heard John Kirby asked. Why was the intercept video released? And if there's any concern about how Russia might use it to portray the war as Russia versus the United States.
First of all, it's not unusual for us to release imagery of unsafe, unprofessional incidents. We've done that in other situations. And so particularly in this case, given the reckless and dangerous behavior, and to demonstrate publicly what type of actions the Russians had taken, we felt that it was important to provide this imagery. Certainly, there are certain considerations that we have to take into account when dealing with imagery, to include the classification, to ensure that we're not inadvertently putting out sensitive information. But in this case, we were able to work through that and provide that. As far as Russian perceptions, again, I think it's important to take a step back and look at the big picture here. The United States focus in the region, the focus with Ukraine, is solely on providing Ukraine with the support that it needs to defend itself. You've heard us say before that Ukraine has a right to defend itself, and we have a right to help them alongside the international community to do that. So the United States does not seek conflict with Russia. We do not seek escalation with Russia. And so we're going to continue to stay focused on our primary mission in the Ukraine area, which is supporting Ukraine in its fight.
And declassifying the video and releasing it, Russia has suggested that it didn't show the actual contact. how does this really just counter that narrative and show that this happened the way that the Pentagon has said it has?
Yeah, well, I think that our words and our actions speak for themselves, and similarly, Russia's inaccurate information, false information, obfuscation, grasping at straws, changing narratives also speaks for itself. So we're going to stay focused on the facts, and we're going to stay focused on our mission.
Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder, who is also an Air Force Brigadier General, with reporters today in the Pentagon briefing room. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, is vice chair of the Intelligence Committee. He told CBS Mornings this morning that the U.S. should continue operating drones over the Black Sea, despite the fact that Russia has claimed that area as its own. And in fact, the U.S. should protect the drones if necessary.
This was a deliberate effort. This wasn't some accident. It wasn't some harassment effort that went awry. This was a design. They basically decided we are going to begin to shoot down U.S. assets, whatever's flying in what they call restricted airspace. It's over international waters, international airspace, but they declare a restriction over it. For whatever reason, they want to conduct military operations. And they're saying anything that flies in there, we're going to shoot it down. So this is a direct test of the Biden administration. They're trying to see what the limits are, and it's a message of their displeasure. But more importantly, I think it's a test to see if we'll respond to it, if we'll continue to fly, or if this causes us not to fly in that area anymore.
Well, Senator, you're talking about intentional harassment and a decision to shoot down an American aircraft. What should happen? How should the U.S. respond?
I think our response should be to fly more of these in that area and to potentially have them escorted by U.S. fighter jets who are manned and have the capability to respond. These are unarmed platforms. They're generally out there for reconnaissance, to see what's happening in the ocean, to have a situational awareness of what's going on in the area, totally according to international law. And so I think we should fly more of them. We shouldn't stop flying them. And in many cases, we should be prepared to scramble jets and respond if they are threatened by Russian aircraft.
Senator Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, vice chair of the Intelligence Committee, on CBS this morning. Today, Poland's president said his country will provide Ukraine with about a dozen MiG-29 fighter jets that will make Poland the first NATO member to respond to Ukraine's repeated requests for military warplanes. You're listening to Washington Today, a story from CNN, the Biden administration threatening to ban TikTok from the United States unless the app's Chinese owners agree to spin off their share of the social media platform. TikTok acknowledged Wednesday evening. The apparent ultimatum by a U.S. multi-agency panel known as Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, marks a possible turning point in the long-running negotiations between federal officials concerning TikTok's links to China and a wildly popular social media company with more than 100 million U.S. users. China said Thursday the United States was unreasonably suppressing TikTok and spreading false information about data security. That from CNN. Questions about this today to the White House Press Secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre.
A question on TikTok. Over 100 million people now use this app. What is your message to them about why you're so concerned about this platform? What is the president's greatest fear about TikTok?
So we've talked about this many times from here before. The president has spoken about this. Look, we want to make sure that our administration, okay. We're okay over there? Oh, budget TikTok. Smart. Okay, so look, we've expressed concerns over China's potential use of software platforms that could endanger or threaten America's safety and their national security. So that is the president's concern. That is why we have called on Congress to take action. We see a bipartisan piece of legislation that that we are supporting. It's called the Restrict Act, as you all know and been covering. And so that's the president's main priority, to make sure when it comes to their safety, when it comes to their security, when it comes to our national security, that those things are protected. And so that has been the president's focus over the last couple of years.
Last month, the president said he wasn't sure if the U.S. should ban TikTok when he was asked about this. Now the administration seems to be hardening its stance. You're backing this legislation, as you mentioned. We've learned, now warning that a possible ban could be at risk here. What changed?
So look, when it comes to CFIUS, which is, I'm not going to get ahead of CFIUS, they're the ones who are reviewing this, this particular software and app, TikTok obviously. So not going to get ahead of their process. There's a process here. We try to stay away from that process. Again, going to support the bipartisan legislation that I've just spoke to. Look, the bottom line is that when it comes to potential threats to our national security, when it comes to the safety of Americans, when it comes to their privacy, we're going to speak out, and we're going to be very clear about that, and the president has been the last 2 years. And so we're asking Congress to act. We're asking Congress to move forward with this bipartisan legislation, the Restrict Act, as I just mentioned, and we're going to continue to do so.
And just one more on this. China says that the U.S. hasn't presented evidence that this app threatens U.S. national security. They say that this is simply about suppressing foreign companies. Is there evidence that the U.S. has that has been presented?
Look, what I can say is CFIUS has a process that they're going through. We're going to let them go through their process. We have concerns, as we have said many times before, about this particular software software platforms, and so we take the national security very seriously. The president takes that very seriously. The safety of Americans very seriously. The privacy of Americans very seriously. And so we're not going to get ahead of the review, but certainly we again support this bipartisan legislation that we're seeing out of Congress.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre with reporters in the White House briefing room. The White House told federal agencies on February 27th they had 30 days to delete the TikTok app from government devices. Also, almost half of U.S. states have banned TikTok from their government devices. Canada has done this, India has done this, and today Great Britain also joining the list, banning TikTok from government devices. Senator Josh Hawley, Republican from Missouri, recently introduced a bill to stop Chinese corporations and entities linked to the Chinese Communist Party from buying U.S. farmland. The bill is titled This Land is Our Land Act. He told Fox News Digital no Chinese corporation or individual associated with the CCP should be permitted to own American farmland. It undermines the integrity of our nation's food supply chain. It presents national security threats when the land is in proximity to military installations, and it hurts American farmers. This issue came up today when the Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack testified before the Senate Agriculture Committee. The question's coming from Senator Mike Braun, Republican from Indiana.
Hearing it a lot, too, in foreign ownership of ag ground. Senator Tester and I are introducing a bill on that. It's starting to cascade across the country among state legislatures addressing it. Where are you at there? And the four players that you hear mostly about, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Should they be owning farm ground in this country?
Well, first of all, how much farmland do you think they own?
I'm worried about owning more in the future. Do you think you're okay with those four players? Just them?
I have concerns, and I particularly have concerns if they're purchasing land that is adjacent to or near military installations or other ways in which security could be compromised, for sure. As you look at prohibitions, understand that they own, between the four of them, roughly 330,000 acres. The five largest owners of foreign land in this country are Canada, Netherlands, UK, Germany, and Japan. And so I think the question is, you're going to restrict those folks. If you don't restrict those and restrict other folks, how do you do this in a way that's...
Senator Tester and I will probably be back to get your opinion on it, and hopefully you'll be behind the bill. Thank you.
Senator Mike Braun, Republican from Indiana, questioning Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack at today's hearing before the Senate Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. The website 538.com has this. In 1978, Congress passed the Agriculture Foreign Investment Disclosure Act, driven by concerns over American families leaving farms and the security of the U.S. food supply. The law required that foreign ownership of farmland be reported to the United States Department of Agriculture, and the first report in 1980 found that less than 0.5% of farmland was owned by foreign investors or entities. Now, foreign investors hold just 3.1% of all privately owned agricultural land in the United States, according to the most recent USDA report, which covers through the end of 2021. Washington Today continues in a moment.
There are a lot of places to get political information, but only at C-SPAN do you get it straight from the source. No matter where you are from or where you stand on the issues, C-SPAN is America's network. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. If it happens here, or here, or here, or anywhere that matters, America is watching on C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. Senate today taking a step toward officially repealing the two Iraq authorizations of the use of military force, or AUMFs, the one from 1991 and 2002. Vote in the Senate to advance the bill was 68 to 27, more than the 60 votes needed. Amendments and a vote on final passage expected next week. The White House says President Biden will sign this bill into law if it passes the Senate. He wants to work with Congress to replace what he calls outdated authorizations with a narrow and specific framework more appropriate to protecting Americans from modern terrorist threats. On today's Senate vote, voting yes, all the Senate Democrats, the 2 Senate Independents, and 19 Republicans. Speaking on the Senate floor before that vote, the lead sponsors, Democrat Tim Kaine and Republican Todd Young. First, Senator Kaine of Virginia.
Right now, we still have not one but 2 active war authorizations against the government of Iraq that is no longer an enemy, but in the biblical phrase, we've beaten the sword into a plowshare. Iraq is now a strategic partner of the United States. The bill that Senator Young and I have worked on in close coordination with other colleagues would repeal both authorizations. It's a clean and simple bill, barely a page long. It has attracted bipartisan support, as my colleague mentioned, not only in the Senate and House, but from stakeholder groups who care about Americans' military, national security, and the health and fate of our troops and veterans and their families. It is a very, very broad ideological spectrum of America that support this bill. It's a rare coalition, and it speaks to how painfully evident it is that the repeal of these authorizations is long, long overdue. This Sunday, March 19, marks the 20th anniversary of the United States invasion of Iraq in March of 2002. That war ended 12 years ago. The Persian Gulf War of 1991, Operation Desert Storm, ended 30 years ago.
Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, on the Senate floor. That 2002 Iraq War AUMF has been used by presidents for military operations beyond its original scope. President Barack Obama invoked it to fight ISIS, and President Donald Trump used it when authorizing a strike that took out Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. Also supporting the bill on the Senate floor, Senator Todd Young, Republican from Indiana.
I think many Americans will be surprised to learn that these authorizations for use of military force, or AUMFs, especially the 1991 Gulf War resolution, are still on the books. Today, these are, in the words of my friend Tim Kaine, who joins me on the floor today, zombie resolutions. They have fulfilled their purpose, and now they should be removed from our law. Importantly, the repeal of the 91 and 02 resolutions would affect no current military operations. So the issue for us to consider is both what these AMFs actually do authorize and what they could be used to authorize in the future. It's been well over a decade since any administration has cited the 2002 AUMF to authorize any military action. However, leaving these authorities on the books creates an opportunity for abuse by the executive branch and bypasses Congress on the most important issue we consider as a body, which is how and when to send our men and women in uniform into harm's way.
Senator Todd Young, Republican from Indiana, on the Senate floor before the successful procedural vote to advance this bill. With more on the Senate moving to repeal the Iraq War authorizations of the use of military force, 1991 and 2002. Joining us on the phone is Allison Jaslow, CEO of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Thank you for being with us. Does your group support this repeal, and why?
The repeal of the authorization of military force for the Iraq War is important to a lot of veterans. It was not only a complicated war, but it was a war that many would say, in the rear view, wasn't effectively scrutinized before we went into it. And that's a lot of what the AUMF process is about and the debate that leads up to our wars. So not only do we have a lot of lessons learned about the Iraq War specifically, leaving an authorization in place is also reckless, and members of Congress shirking their responsibility to undo their authorization, which allows, a future president to potentially exploit the authorization. So essentially, repealing it is just Congress doing their job. And I think many Americans, but definitely many veterans, have wanted to see better leadership when it comes to how and when we send our troops into harm's way out of our elected leaders. And I'm glad that Congress is now hopefully stepping up the plate to repeal a war authorization that was passed over 20 years ago for a war that we're telling ourselves doesn't exist anymore with somebody who a country that we now consider a strategic partner. So it feels like the right thing to do, and it's past due.
You talk about the need for leadership when sending troops into harm's way. Many members of Congress say the current system is broken. Congress has not declared war since World War II. Instead, the president acts, usually in response to a crisis, sends in the troops, and then Congress plays catch-up with these AUMFs, and then they, in this case, stick around for a long time. How should this be reformed?
I don't know that I have all of the answers on the reform. It is extremely important that our citizenry be engaged more than anything else. I think in Washington, D.C., you can get really drawn into process quickly, but there's some basic principles here at play. The Iraq authorization for military force is one thing, but to your point about crisis, the authorization for military force following the 9/11 attacks that originally allowed us to go to war in Afghanistan to retaliate against al-Qaeda is also still in place. And there are troops deployed today in places like Syria. There actually are troops in Iraq today. There are troops in places like Somalia fighting terrorism abroad, which there may be a very good rationale to do. But the reality is most Americans don't realize that that's happening, that it's happening because Congress is allowing it to happen. And until the American people, in my view, care about the fact that, troops are in harm's way and that Congress isn't effectively debating it, then Congress just won't. So I don't know that it's necessarily a reform of the system or whether politicians need to feel a little more political pressure from the people who have elected them to make sure they're doing right by our servicemen and women and their families who sacrifice alongside them.
We're talking with Allison Jaslow, CEO of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. You made some reference to this before, that there is symbolism here of saying that the Iraq wars, plural, dating back over 30 years, are over. What does that mean to you as a veteran and to your organization?
Well, we're approaching the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War next week. And a war being over, I don't know that you ever fully get closure when you also carry some of that war back with you. Many of us have, experienced loss as a part of the wars. But, more than anything else, I said this before, there are a lot of lessons to be learned about this particular war, the Iraq War. And I think one of the great things about not only closing this chapter officially through action by Congress is it can allow us to once again kind of examine how and why we got ourselves into that particular war, and hopefully have a thoughtful conversation about whether we're going to allow it to happen again. there will be another time where we're going to feel like we need to defend our country, our values abroad. That may involve deploying troops into combat. But with the Iraq War specifically, I think there are some things that we could have done better before we sent troops into harm's way, and also in a way that, I'll speak from my personal experience. When you're a platoon leader leading troops and your troops are beginning to question why they're there, why their buddies are lost, it can be very hard to keep their spirits up, keep them focused on the mission and what's in front of us in that moment. And so the only thing you hold on to in that moment is that there's a bigger picture that you can't see, that, the people back at home and the politicians who have asked you to go there know what the bigger picture is, the bigger strategic goals, and that they are looking out for your best interest back at home. And I think, in retrospect, we were failed by many of our leaders in those very important moments. And I hope the big takeaway from the Iraq War, and I hope the conversation not just around the AUMFs, but when we remember the 20th anniversary and every other anniversary of this war, that we can remind ourselves of how we could have done better by our troops as it related to the Iraq War, and make certain that we don't make a decision like that again.
Allison Jaslow, CEO of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Her Twitter account is @Jaslow, and the organization is iava.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And again, the U.S. Senate voting to advance this bill, bipartisan vote, getting 68 votes, more than the 60 needed. The amendment process and final passage votes will be taking place next week. CBS News reports a bipartisan group of members of the House, Barbara Lee, Democrat, Chip Roy, Republican, Abigail Spanberger, Democrat, Tom Cole, Republican, also introduced a bill to repeal the Iraq authorizations in the House in early February, but it's not yet advanced out of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Veterans Affairs Department is updating its motto to reflect the diversity of veterans today, both men and women, different family structures. The original motto was adopted in 1959 and taken from President Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1865. The original motto said that they would fulfill President Lincoln's promise to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan. The new motto will be, fulfill President Lincoln's promise to care for those who have served in our nation's military and for their families, caregivers, and survivors. The Veterans Affairs Secretary Dennis McDonough making this announcement of the change at the Women in Military Service for America Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery.
So today we take a step forward. One step, and there's many, many more to go. But today we take a step toward making sure all who have served know VA is their VA. Today we're bringing our mission statement into the moment, embracing the fullest meaning of President Lincoln's sentiments, promise, and unquenchable passion, reflected in President Biden's charge to fulfill what he rightly calls our nation's one solemn obligation, to equip those we send into harm's way, and to care for them when they return home, to care for every single veteran. Going forward, VA's mission statement will read, to fulfill President Lincoln's promise to care for those who have served in our nation's military and for their families, their caregivers, and their survivors.
Veterans Affairs Secretary Dennis McDonough. Associated Press reporting that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin ordered a number of improvements in access to mental health care on Thursday to reduce suicides in the military, but held off on endorsing more controversial recommendations to restrict gun and ammunition purchases by young troops, sending them to another panel for study. A bill to put recent Supreme Court decisions dealing with the Second Amendment rights into federal law has been introduced by Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, ranking member on the Judiciary Committee. He held a news conference today referencing a hearing the committee held yesterday on the impact of last year's Supreme Court decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Braun, which found that a New York State law restricting concealed carry of firearms was unconstitutional.
The hearing yesterday was setting the stage for Democrats to come after the Braun decision. There's two decisions by the Supreme Court that have happened in recent years, pretty close to each other. The Heller decision said the Second Amendment is an individual right, John, that you have and I have and everybody in the country has to own a weapon responsibly. The Braun decision said if you try to regulate lawful gun ownership, you have to look at an analysis historical in nature, because the Second Amendment was designed to allow people to defend themselves in dangerous situations outside their home. There's nothing in the Second Amendment about you can own a gun in your home and nowhere else. So the New York law made it impossible to own a weapon to defend yourself outside your home, and the Supreme Court struck it down, and here's what liberals want to do. They want to change that law. And if they get control of the Supreme Court, these cases will change. This is a concerted effort to attack the fundamentals of the Second Amendment as part of an effort to maintain control of the Senate, take back the House, and win the White House. To conservatives, this is a wake-up call. We need you. Understand what's going on here. So what is the Republican response on the Judiciary Committee? We're going to take the holdings of Heller. You can own a gun individually. That's a right given to you by the Second Amendment. And the holdings of Braun, that you have the right to protect yourself by owning a gun responsibly, even outside your home, and make it part of federal statutory law.
Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, at a news conference today. He mentioned that's John Kennedy, a Republican senator from Louisiana, also on the committee, who joined him, and every Republican on the Judiciary Committee co-sponsoring this bill. Senator Graham started by saying the bill is in response to a hearing the Judiciary Committee held Wednesday on the Supreme Court decision in the Braun case. This is what the committee chair, Democrat Dick Durbin of Illinois, said on Wednesday at the hearing about the decision.
After the Braun decision, long-standing gun laws on the books are being challenged across the country, more than 100 cases so far. And under the new Braun historical test, judges decide not whether a law reasonably protects public safety, but whether the law resembles laws that were in place in 1791 or in 1868. In the beginning, in 1791, of course, we were talking about muzzle-loading muskets. I think about drawing that standard, legality and constitutionality, based on 1791. And I think about last 4th of July in Highland Park, Illinois, when a deranged individual went on the roof of a downtown business and discharged 83 rounds in 60 seconds, killing 7 innocent people and injuring dozens of others, including paralyzing an 8-year-old little boy, Cooper Roberts. So it's no surprise to see decisions like the Fifth Circuit's recent Rahimi case. A panel of judges struck down a federal law barring those with domestic violence restraining orders from possessing guns. I can't square that decision with the actual danger that women and police officers face from armed domestic abusers. And I don't believe the founders of this nation would have wanted courts to simply ignore this danger when applying the Constitution they wrote.
Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, Judiciary Committee chair at Wednesday's hearing on that 2022 Supreme Court decision that struck down the New York State concealed carry law. You can find this full hearing at C-SPAN's video library, cspan.org. And thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.